We're back, and it's a delight to say we're joined by a friend and colleague of many years, a man I have regarded as a really remarkably courageous as well as highly effective freedom fighter, particularly for the cause of his native state of Israel, as well as for, I think, the interests of the free world more generally. He is Itamar Marcus. He is the founder and director of a terrific organization, Palestinian Media Watch. He, back in the day, served as a negotiator for the government of Israel with the Palestinians on an issue that he has followed intensively and I think with great effect, namely the deliberate incitement to violence that the Palestinian Authority and various other factions, of course, like Hamas, have consistently engaged in, including, not least, with our taxpayer subsidies. We're going to talk with him about all of that and more. Itamar Marcus, welcome to Securing America. It's been a long time since we've talked. I'm so glad to catch up with you.
Thank you so much for inviting me back, Frank. It's always great to be with you.
Part of the reason I'm anxious to do so, Itamar, is of course there has been a considerable uptick lately, as you know, of violence in Israel at the hands of Palestinians. And I wanted to just take stock with you. Is this a function, once again, of this practice of inciting it on the part of the so called Partners for Peace with Israel, the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas and company?
Yes, you're absolutely right that we've been actually warning about this for a number of months. Probably already in February, we released a report showing that the Palestinian Authority was definitely interested in having low scale violence. Low scale violence means not having masses of soldiers or Palestinian policemen going out shooting, but they want people to go out with their knives, individuals with guns, as well as possibly people with cars. They have a term for this. They call it popular resistance or popular uprising. Since February, we have had incessant calls for this. In fact, there was an event of the PLO where Abbas spoke, and the newspaper reported that he personally called for everyone to increase the popular resistance. And then another person talked about every speech at this event was about popular resistance. So the Palestinian Authority, because it's weak right now, because in the polls, the majority of Palestinians are sick of them because of corruption. They needed violence, and so they have been encouraging violence, encouraging what they call popular resistance. Now, with this term comes a lot of hate incitement, so that people will be motivated to be violent. So, for example, they're talking about Israel defiling the Al-Aqsa Mosque. They're talking about Israel making it difficult for them to get to the Al-Aqsa Mosque during Ramadan, constantly accusing Israel, numerous libels of every. They're talking all lately about Israel intentionally maltreating prisoners so that they get sick and that they die and there's a dying prisoner. So all of these libels are coming out to create hatred, and at the same time, he calls for this violence. So absolutely, this did not
And to be
come in
clear,
a vacuum.
yeah, it's not happening in a vacuum, and it is happening with effect. And there have been numbers of Americans, excuse me, of Israeli citizens who have been murdered with these knife wielding or other violent acts from the Palestinians. And the incitement goes down to, as you've documented extensively, Itamar Marcus, to grade school indoctrination of children, does it not?
Absolutely. We just released a report, and we're going to come out with a proper version of this report on a Fatah magazine. Fatah, again, this is the so called moderates, Fatah. And in this magazine, which is for 5 year olds, for 5 to 15-year olds, they glorify martyrdom. They tell the children that they should be participating in violence. And when children are killed in terror attacks, those children are glorified. So this is and why does the Palestinian Authority send their kids out to die? Because they know it's good for PR. When Israel is forced to shoot into a crowd of terrorists, and among them happens to be a 15-year-old, or if a 15-year-old goes with a knife and stabs an Israeli and then is shot and killed, the Palestinians scream to the world, Israel killed another 15-year-old, and they don't mention that he had just stabbed someone.
Right. And so when you look at all of this taken together, it bespeaks, obviously, Well, a dishonesty at the very least, if not an actual deceptiveness on the part of the Palestinians, who we are told by, among others, Secretary of State Anthony Blinken in this so-called Negev summit a week or two ago, are actually committed to peace and are necessarily going to be the next focus of American diplomacy in the region, something that the Trump administration had abandoned, I think, quite properly, given the lack of integrity in this process that the incitement campaign makes perfectly clear. How do you see what the United States is doing at the moment in terms of trying to breathe new life into the Palestinian so-called peace process against the backdrop of this kind of conduct?
Well, there are two possibilities. One is that there's willful blindness on the part of the leadership. Uh, for some reason, American leaders have always hated the fact that there was no what they called progress toward a peace process, and they did whatever they could, usually giving incredible benefits and hundreds of millions, I should say by now billions of dollars to the Palestinian Authority in the hope that they would join a peace process, but they never have. Uh, President Trump understood better than anyone before him that the Palestinian Authority is lying, and he gave up on them and he went toward the Gulf states and he created a peace very quickly between the Gulf states and Israel. The new
By
administration,
essentially setting aside the whole idea that the focus of American diplomacy towards the Middle East in general had to be centered around the Palestinian struggle, right?
absolutely, it was a brilliant, brilliant decision, and it was Israel and the Gulf states are going to benefit for hopefully many years to come. Not first of which is in an alliance against Iran, and hopefully afterward with all sorts of economic benefits that the two countries will have for the long term. And um, but the Palestinian
Not
Authority
not
doesn't want to
no
get
no
get a
credit to the Biden team though, if that is the case, because in
no,
fact at
absolutely
this
not.
Negev summit, as we've been talking about on this program, every effort was made to really hijack the whole effort on the Abraham Accords and their follow-on work by inserting, by the
Look, I'll
Secretary of
just tell you
State,
something. The
Palestine as
this
the centerpiece.
Yeah, this report that we published on this Palestinian Fatah magazine for children called WAED, 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 which means the promise. Um, One of the key messages that we studied, by the way, we went back 17 magazines and we studied every message. There was never a message of living beside Israel, together with Israel. There were repeated messages over and over again that the end game is eliminating Israel, liberating what they called all of Palestine from the river to the sea. All the Jews are going to leave, just like the French left Algeria. This is Fatah Mahmoud Abbas. And by the way, anyone who funds the Palestinian Authority is funding this magazine, is
Yeah.
funding this hatred.
Well,
So,
to that point, we are supposed to not be funding certain activities of the Palestinian Authority, including, essentially subsidies for terrorism and families of terrorists, particularly if they get killed in the process. Where does that stand at the moment? Is that still ongoing? Are we still, American taxpayers, still providing funds that wind up in those kinds of
well,
activities?
one of the most important bills that was passed under the Trump administration was the Taylor Force Act. The Taylor Force Act prohibits the United States government from giving funding directly to the Palestinian Authority into their general budget. And the Biden administration is looking for ways to bypass that. Now, the only way that Taylor Force would no longer hinder the Biden administration if the Palestinian Authority would stop paying salaries to terrorists in prison, to murderers, to killers, people like Abdallah Barghouti. Just have to give you a sense of what this means. Abdallah Barghouti built the bombs that murdered 67 Israelis in suicide bombings. He is serving 67 life sentences. And since he's gone to jail, the Palestinian Authority has paid him over $270,000 in monthly salaries. $270,000. So this is
And
just
do we have
one
reason to
person.
believe that came from us?
Until the Taylor Force Act came into effect during the he was arrested in 2003. From 2003 till a couple of years ago, when the Taylor Force American money was paying the salary of this murderer, who, by the way, killed many Americans as well.
But
Um,
Itamar, are you saying that that is not the case today? That the Biden administration is honoring the Taylor Force Act, or are you saying that we're
They're
watching
trying
them sort
to
of get
bypass it a
around it?
little bit. What they're
Okay.
doing is they've been giving tens of millions of dollars to what they're calling humanitarian projects, so that they're giving the money to specific projects as opposed to giving it to the general budget. But worse than that is they're working with the Palestinian Authority to have them create some kind of fiction so that they won't be paying the salaries to the terrorists, but they actually on paper, but in fact, the salaries will be going to the Palestinians in another way. And I'll just give you one example that the Palestinians have already reported on, and that is that aside from the terrorists in prison, and there are 4,500 of them, there are about 7,500 released prisoners who continue to get the high salaries. So, what's the Palestinian Authority doing? They're taking those prisoners and they're putting into government ministries and giving them fictitious jobs in the government ministries so that they won't be getting paid by the Palestinian Ministry of Prisoners. They'll be getting paid by the Ministry of Education, the Ministry of Security, all these, and then they'll be
A
able to tell the
subterfuge,
Americans,
in other words.
yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
Itamar, we
That's
have to leave it at that. This is such an important part of the story, and the work that you do chronicling it and exposing it is invaluable. And I hope that we'll have a chance to talk with you further about it in the days ahead. Also, whether a new government in Israel might make a difference in this regard as well as others, but that's for another day. I want to thank you for joining us. Come back to us soon. We're going to talk with Kevin Freeman next about what the Biden administration has in mind for cryptocurrency. Will they do the same damage to it as to the dollar? What are the implications? Right after this.